And welcome, welcome, welcome. This is Peter Winnick. I'm the founder and CEO of Thought Leadership Leverage, and you're joining us on the podcast today, which is Leveraging Thought Leadership. Today, my guest is Keld Jensen. Keld brings a unique blend of real-world experience and strategic problem solving to the global conversation on optimizing business transactions. He's the founder and CEO of MarketWatch Center for Negotiations. He's got 20 years experience as a speaker. His speaking engagements have been at international conferences all over the world, right? Denmark, Lithuania. He's a contributor at Forbes. He's been on the top thought global leaders in trust. And there are many books that he has written as I look through here. We're not going to get through all those, but several that he has written along the way. So welcome aboard today, Keld.
Thank you, Peter, for having me.
Great. So you've got lots of the boxes checked, right? So speaker, author, advisor, consultant, etc. Give us a quick overview of how all those various pieces play together in a systemic way. What does Keld's universe look like?
Well, it's a very complicated universe, Pete, I have to tell you. Basic, you mentioned most of the stuff. I'm an author, obviously, having published 24 books in a number of countries. I'm born and raised in Denmark, moved to the US for about 10 years ago. I'm a dual citizen today. And I really consider, I know it sounds very popular to say that, but I really consider the world my workplace. I'm working in Asia and Europe and North America in general. So I'm typically working with middle-sized to Fortune 500 organization, and that could be anything from classroom training, advisory services. I'm doing a lot of keynotes, and then I'm a professor at a university here in the US and 2 universities in Europe. So all of this involved a lot of traveling, but it's great fun. Otherwise, I wouldn't do it.
Great. So talk about, you given that you've written 24 books, my assumption is there's probably 10 more ideas for books floating in your head. What's changed not on the content side, but on the just sort of the landscape of publishing between your first book and your 24th book? And what are you doing differently about it?
That's a very good question. When you do your first book, you think you're going to save the world. That's your baby, right? When the first book is out, you're looking at it with loving eyes, and you think this is the most important thing since forever. And you have a tendency to think that it will actually change the world. And obviously you should believe in that every time you publish a book, within management at least. Then you get surprised because it doesn't really create a lot of awareness or attention because as all of us knows, so many books out there today, especially since everybody's been able to self-publish and everybody's been able basically just to launch their own book and, in any possible way. So it's a very crowded market. What I would say is important, and what I've learned from publishing the book is it's actually helping me focusing my thoughts. And obviously, it's also kind of a blueprint for you as an authority, especially when you have a number of books out there that has been published by publishers and they've been published globally. So that means that publishers in China and Malaysia and Japan and Germany and England and the US and whatever.
I want to touch on that first point you made for a moment, though. Let me pause you there for a minute. So, because I've heard this on more than one occasion, and you would think there are easier ways to get from point A to point B, but not always the case, that oftentimes one of the outcomes, one of the benefits of writing a book is it's a forcing mechanism to get the author to codify their thinking in a succinct and clear and teachable way. So you might have all this stuff floating around in your mind and this expertise, but it's not particularly organized because you only need to retrieve it out of your, the RAM of your brain. So tell me about sort of a little bit more about how a book forces you to get really tight and clear about it.
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say the biggest challenge for me is actually keeping a book down to a normal size, because I always end up with 3 times the material that I need for a book. And then the biggest challenge for me, and I guess that goes for a lot of authors, is really trying to filter and limit the information that goes in the book. So if you have a very good book editor and you're working with a good book editor, they are usually the partner that will keep you challenged on what is really the interesting thing that you need to keep in the book. What I learned, though, throughout the period is that a lot of the leftovers that doesn't go into a book is something that you can use later on. It might be something that you change or switch around or do whatever with, and then it goes into the next book, because all of it is obviously relevant. And then there's another very important part in all of this, Peter, that I know you are very experienced on as well, and that is obviously the timing. I mean, you could, in theory, have the greatest book with the greatest idea, but if those ideas are a little bit out of time and is not the right time to launch it, you have to be very aware of when is the right time to bring something out, and when is the world ready.
Yeah, so let's touch on. I think there's another key point you made there. I want to press on is for you, and I don't think this is particularly unusual. It starts off with so much stuff in the beginning to boil it down to 250 pages. And I think I call it sort of the curse of the expert, right? So
yeah,
there's you can go so deep on a topic because this is what you do, right? So you can go, to the PhD level, literally, on a particular topic. But when you go to put that in a book, unless you're writing, biography of Ben Franklin or something like that, nobody wants to read 700 or 800 pages. And the challenge is to get it to not the minimum, but what is the essentials? What is the, what's too much? And it's a bit of the Goldilocks problem. And it doesn't mean, I like what you said, that the stuff that doesn't make it in the book gets used in other ways, in other formats, etc. But I think that's a challenge that experts have, is saying, but there's so much to say about this topic. Understanding that on the receiving end, I'm not going to commit 40 hours of my life to learning whatever it is, right? So give me the TED Talk. If I like what you have to say, maybe I'll buy the book, and so whatever. So how do you deal with the challenge of, condensed attention span of the universe today?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And I love the phrase you just coined there, saying, the curse of the expert, because the same goes when I'm delivering a keynote. When you're done, you feel that, oh my God, there's so much that I didn't give them. I would have liked to told them this as well and that as well. And I didn't mention that. And but by time you learn, obviously there's a limitation. So you basically, and I think my approach to doing a keynote today is the same as writing a book. I basically just list 3, 4, 5 key items. That is my ambition. If I deliver these 5 key items throughout the whole book or throughout the whole keynote, I'm happy. I actually got the message across. I got across what is really important at this moment, at this time. Because exactly the curse of the expert, if you want to hand everything over, it's a never-ending story, and you just end up confusing the receiver, because it's just, a data dump instead of trying to just get some very specific that is needed right now.
Yep. So given that you're global, right, and as many of us are, you're more global than most, I would argue, given that you've got dual citizenship, and you split your time between the States and Europe. Talk a little bit about the similarities and then the differences on the business side of speaking in North America versus Europe, because they're very different markets with different pricing and different expectations. And tell us about your experiences on both sides of the pond, if you will.
Yes, that's a great question. I'm in this interesting, funny position where I can look from the outside in, both into the US and from outside in Europe. And there's a big difference. The audience and the speaker platform in Europe and the US are very different from each other. And the typical American speaker will not be as easily accepted in Europe, just as well as the European speaker will not be that easily accepted in the US, for several reasons. That's one part. I'm getting back to that in a second. The other part is that if we're looking at the fee structure, the speaker in North America, specifically the US, there's a big difference between the US and Canada as well. But if we look at the US, the fee is generally higher in the US than you would find in Europe. So if there's any of your audience out there, Peter, listening, saying, I would love to speak in Europe, that's great. And it's fun for traveling out there, but your fee will generally be lower than it will be in the US. However, though, if you do it correctly and you adapt into the European mentality when you are speaking, you can actually get a great crowd, because, the grass is always greener. So in Europe, they are interested in actually getting American speakers in. Now, what they dislike in Europe is the typical, how can I put it? Because I consider myself American today as well, so I'm offending myself. But they don't appreciate the typical American expert, self-confident speaker that just comes in there and know it all. They are a little bit more humble. They are not being, how can I put it nicely? They're not being convinced as easily as the typical American audience, I would say. So
I would say, let's try this. I would say from my experience, some of the motivational, hubris, arrogant stuff that plays well in North America doesn't play well. I think they honor the gravitas and the thoughtfulness first and the theatrics less. And in the States, it might be a little bit the opposite, if I were to nicely say that.
I would agree. I would agree with you. Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So it's not a downside to come from the US. It's not a downside being American.
Sure.
I mean, they are very intrigued and very open and like everything that comes from the US, because obviously so many things are coming from the US, especially in the management sphere. You just have to be careful as a speaker how you present and introduce yourself. And I'm even being told now, Peter, when I go back to Europe, that, oh, you are certainly becoming American now. So, you know, I'm kind of adapting the American way as well. So European—
That might not be a compliment. Depending on who's saying it, that might not be meant as a compliment. I want to touch on what you said about the fee structure, because I have a little bit of a different take on that. So for a traditional North American speaker, right, that's going to Europe, my experience has been is in the right circumstances at the right price point, they will pay a premium. So if you're a American New York Times best-selling author, blah blah blah, speaker, typically you should be commanding 1.5 times your fee, because the other thing is, if you lived in, say, Denver and you're keynoting in Chicago, that's a different amount of time being consumed than if you lived in, Seattle and you're doing a gig in Belgium, right? So somebody has to pay for that time, unless you can stack up, hey, I'll be here 2 weeks and do a bunch. But domestically, I agree with you that the European rate is, a $20,000 domestic speaker in the US, the comparable in Europe might be 12 or 15. It's just a different market, just different price points.
No, I absolutely agree with you. And then there's psychology in this as well, because I noticed that when I'm back in Europe and delivering a keynote, I'm always being introduced as, and he came all the way from United States, so it's
there's something exotic.
Exactly. I agree with you. If you can coin that correctly, if you can market that correctly, you can actually charge a premium just for the fact that you are further away, If somebody, as you mentioned, Peter, is sitting in Belgium and need a speaker, he will, if he can attract the right expert from the US, be willing to pay more than if he was attracting the same speaker from Paris, just for the fact that the US is further away. So it is more exotic getting something. Sure. So in that aspect, I completely agree with you.
If you're enjoying this episode of Leveraging Thought Leadership, please make sure to subscribe. If you'd like to help spread the word about our podcast, please leave us a review and share it with your friends. We're available on Apple Podcast and on all major listening apps, as well as at thoughtleadershipleverage.com/podcasts. So how do you integrate speaking into the other areas of your business? And what I mean by that is there are folks that are very selective about where they speak because they're only looking to speak in places that become, where the clients become consulting clients or licensing their content. There are other speakers that say, listen, I'll speak to pretty much any management or leadership audience. I love what I do. How do you thread that needle and integrate the other solutions and ways that your business operates so that speaking is supported by, the other businesses are supported by speaking?
Yeah, great question. I would say that I'm a little lucky since my field is collaboration and negotiation, and it's kind of a niche area. So when I'm invited as a keynote speaker, it is typically already an audience that will be a potential continued client base for me.
So it's self-selected based on the subject matter. It's self-selected.
Exactly. It's very rare that I'm standing in front of somebody that is far away from the world of contracting or legal or negotiation or collaboration or whatever. It is typical already an audience that will be potential clients for me.
So that's a good thing.
No, that makes life easier. And it's typically either conferences or major corporations that would invite me. And obviously that is somebody that typically knows me already. So that means it is within my field. So somebody who's been reading my book, knows what I've been doing, has been looking me up online, whatever, So that is the typical audience. So in general, Peter, I don't have the difficulties of later on identifying whether that audience I'm speaking in front of is potential for me or not.
Okay, so give examples then of, and it doesn't have to be specific, but you go to speak, they see you speak, and then what is that next step? Because I think a lot of speakers struggle with being really clear about what that client journey is, right? So I buy your book for $20, $30, I see you speak, or I bring you in to speak for X dollars, and then after that, these are the problems that you can solve, either you directly or you with derivative offerings of your content. So what does that sort of product journey look like for the ideal client for you?
Yeah, that varies a lot.
Okay.
Let me just take one step back and just go back to my first book and all the
Yes.
fun I had with that book. Because when I launched my first book, I was actually thinking, hey, my God, this is great. I can just sit back and the phone will start ringing. People will just call me day in and day out and invite me out to do work and consultancy and speaking and whatever because they read a book. And obviously the phone never rang, basically,
Right.
because that is not enough. You can publish a book, nobody will react to that book whatsoever, unless you really have a very unique one that just blows the whole market off. But that didn't happen with my first book. So getting back to the keynote is a little bit the same. You shouldn't do the keynote with the expectation that you walk off stage and the phone will just continue ringing and your email box will be full. To me, anyway, is not happening immediately. But what is funny is that 2 years later, I might get an email from somebody saying, hey, I saw you speak in Boston. It was great. Could you come and help us? I could actually get an email the day after, but typically, I would say it takes a little bit of time. So it's not like I can capitalize on a keynote and just think that, hey, I spoke on Tuesday, so on Thursday, I'll have made X number of amount in revenue. It's not happening that way for me. It's like people take the experience, they take the knowledge, they bring it back home. And then when time is right and they can implement the knowledge that they know they can get from me, then they reach out.
Okay, but so I agree with that, but I would also say that you have to have the systems and processes in place, right? Because there's a time for serendipity, right? Where someone sends you an email and says, hey, hey, Keld, I saw you speak at such and such event 2 years ago, and now I have this problem. But you can accelerate or increase the probability of those things happening by doing things like collecting their email addresses, doing things like, in a professional way, letting the audience know the types of things that you tend to work on, and all the, and coordinating with the sponsor of the event to, maybe contribute an article or a short form video to the audience after as a way to deepen the relationship. What are the systems and processes that you've developed and deployed over the years that help?
Your advice right there is very good, Peter. And I would say in general, I haven't been very good at that. What I typically do though, is I typically try to write an article for the for the sponsor, for the one that is coordinating the event. I very often try to have my book sold at the event as well, because one area where I see a certain effect is the combination of the book and a keynote, because people still, regardless where you are in the world, they still love to walk away with the book of the person they just saw on stage. So the percentage of books you can sell at an event just increases tremendously. And I have very good numbers in percentage of people buying books, percentage of the audience there.
Well, typically that's 25 to 35%, right?
Yes, I very often even go higher. I usually pass even 50 or 60% of the audience.
That's fantastic. Okay,
I'm very happy with that. Yes, but just back to what you said, Peter. That is still not motivating or promoting that people should call me afterwards, because that's
right.
To some people, I believe, and now I'm being awful honest here. I think a lot of the people don't actually buy the book because they go home and read it. They just buy the book because they go home and tell their spouse, "Look, this was the guy I saw on stage, and he signed the book." And then it goes
more of a souvenir, right?
Yeah, exactly. So if I was selling T-shirt, it would probably be by So I completely agree with you. Having a systematic approach that I know you're very good at would be great, because that would definitely increase the potential sales that you could get afterwards. And I haven't been extremely structured on that, but it's been just focused on actually delivering.
Well, and I want to just touch on that, because the business side of speaking in and of itself is very transactional. And this isn't not a judgment to individuals, but it typically works like this. You get in touch with whoever's booking the event through an agent or directly, whatever. Are you available on May the 7th? Yes. What is your fee? My fee is X. Okay, that's within our budget. Oh, great. Our theme is Y. Perfect. Done. Great. We'll see you in a few months, right? Then you get on site, maybe you have a pre-meeting, you do your thing, and you go home. It's not really an ideal scenario for developing a rapport or relationship that's longer than a transaction. And I think the burden is on the speaker to use the speech as the tip of the spear and say, you know what, I don't want to just go out there May the 7th and do my thing for an hour and get the thunderous round of applause. I want to turn them into a client, or I want to turn members of that audience into a client. How am I going to do that in an effective way? What's the research I can do in advance? How do I plan meetings in advance? How do I let people know, et cetera? And I think it takes time and it takes practice, and it's muscles that need to be developed that a lot of people frankly don't have.
I completely agree, because typically I don't have a lot of talks, collaborations, or meetings with a client before the keynote. It goes exactly as you said. Somebody, and sometimes it's even come through one of my speakers agencies, so I just get a request saying, are you available on that date? And I say yes and no. And then we talk about very briefly, what is the audience? How big is it? What is the expectation? And deal done, and I just show up, do my thing and leave,
Exactly. Great. As we start to wind up, any final, because you've been at this game for 20 years and you see things new that have become things, and you've seen things that used to work sort of go the way of the dinosaur. What are 2 or 3 things that you would recommend others out there experiment with, or explore, or take some chances with?
I would say that obviously content is important, and it's important that you deliver quality and you have your product in order. Having said that, because that's kind of what I expect everybody would do, and if you don't have that in order, you're just an amateur. But considering that is in order, then suddenly it's all about making a name of yourself and making some noise in the market, because the market is so crowded. Regardless of what you're doing today, there's so many players out there. And it's really, really hard for the buyer to identify who is it that we should get, whether it's buying a book, getting an advisor, getting a consultant, or getting a speaker. Because everybody's out there telling everybody that they're the best one. And it is really, really complicated for the buyer figuring out who should we actually be using. So as I said, the step 1 is obviously having your product, having the right quality, trying to be different, and delivering real quality and real result to your client. Step 2 is really figuring out, how do I make a name for myself? How do I be different? How do I make a voice? And how can I actually penetrate this forest of voices out there? That is my experience. Very briefly, Peter, I think I told you that in our phone conversation the other day. My experience arriving in the US years ago was that I had a meeting with a publisher in New York, and at that point I published a number of books in Europe. So I met up with the publisher and said, hi there, my name is Keld. I just arrived from the US. I would like you guys to publish one of my books in the US. And I thought the publisher would say, well, thank you for coming. We appreciate that. Of course, we would love to publish a book, sir. But that was not what they told me, Peter. They said, well, that's great. Thank you. What have you done in the US? And then I was quiet for a minute. And I said, well, nothing yet. And then they said, well, give us a call when you've done something.
Exactly.
And that was lesson number 1. That is, you may have a history somewhere, but you need to have your platform ready. You need to have your marketing ready. You need to have your voice just being very unique. So that's one of the advices I would definitely.
Well, and being aware of being, sort of a big fish in a smaller pond and moving to a smaller fish in a bigger pond.
Absolutely.
The burden on standing out from and differentiating content, which is ultimately the product, from the crowd, and knowing your competitors. Well, this has been fantastic. I appreciate your time. I appreciate all you shared with everybody today. Great stuff. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me, Peter.
My pleasure. If you enjoyed this episode, and I do hope that you did, please join our new LinkedIn group, which is exclusively focused on the organizational thought leader, the person in the corporate world that is using thought leadership as part of their job, whether that's developing thought leadership, whether that's deploying thought leadership, whether that's helping others do so. Please take a look and check out our LinkedIn group. We think you'd get a lot of benefit from that. Thank you.